Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So our mission today is to take a really specific snapshot. We're looking at a news brief from May 21st, 2025,
Right.
and we're going to unpack the big developments, what was really shaping the world on that single day.
Yeah, we've got the source material here, and we're basically pulling out the key stuff for you. It's like a rundown of what was buzzing across, well, everything, really. Politics, business.
Science, weather, sports, the whole lot.
Exactly.
The idea is you can quickly get a solid grasp of what was happening then, see how all these different pieces fit together, or maybe didn't seem to.
Okay, let's dive in. Where should we start?
Let's kick off with politics and international affairs. The brief had some pretty significant things going on globally.
Right, and straight away there's this kind of unexpected tension mentioned between the U.S. and South Africa.
Yeah, that jumped out.
It's really interesting how domestic policy suddenly becomes this international thing. The source talks about South Africa's land reform policies.
Right, the ones aimed at addressing the legacy of apartheid.
Exactly. Specifically looking at unused or, underutilized farmland redistribution.
And this apparently became a real flashpoint. The source says U.S. President Donald Trump made a specific accusation against South African President Ramaphosa.
It mentioned unverified videos apparently showing farm attacks.
Now, this is important. The source is very clear that this echoes a narrative often pushed by far-right media.
Yeah, and one that the source says has been repeatedly debunked by human rights groups and crime statisticians.
So while the source does confirm rural violence is a problem in South Africa.
Yes, it is. But the analysts cited, they agree it affects everyone, all demographics.
Not specifically race-based or tied just to land reform like that narrative suggests?
Exactly. It's driven mostly by socioeconomic factors, according to the brief.
Okay, so what was the fallout from this accusation, according to the source?
Well, President Ramaphosa, he rejected the claims, pushed back, and actually tried to pivot, invited the U.S. to talk about a new trade framework.
Interesting tactic. But were there concerns?
Definitely. Worries it could complicate trade talks in the AG. The EGOA negotiations.
The African Growth and Opportunity Act.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and also maybe chill investor confidence. Plus, the source noted Trump's comments got bipartisan condemnation within South Africa.
It really shows how fast things can escalate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How rhetoric, even based on unverified stuff, can impact diplomacy, trade.
Absolutely. And how online narratives can suddenly carry real diplomatic weight.
Okay, moving from that.
Yeah.
The brief also covered a really stark humanitarian situation, the crisis in Gaza.
Yeah, a very different kind of international story. The source provides some context, noting this emergency followed renewed conflict.
And Israel implemented a blockade.
Right. Citing national security concerns, rocket attacks, tunnel operations, that kind of thing. That's Israel's stated reason in the brief.
But the details in the brief about the situation on the ground, they're incredibly grim. It talks about a severe emergency. At least 326 deaths attributed directly to starvation and lack of medical aid.
Yeah, and humanitarian groups reported, in nearly 3 months with no relief aid getting in.
Exactly. Hospitals totally overwhelmed. And the source suggests most of Gaza's population, like 2 million people, were at risk from food scarcity. Just dire.
And what's really crucial here, as the source lays it out, are the different perspectives.
Okay.
You have the UN and humanitarian groups arguing that the blockade's scale and impact, they say it's collective punishment.
Which violates international law, in their view.
That's their argument, yes.
Yeah.
And warning about famine-like conditions, especially for babies, the elderly.
And the other side, Israel's position.
Israel's position, as reported in the source, is that Hamas exploits aid routes, that they use civilian infrastructure for military operations.
Which they argue complicates aid delivery.
Right. Makes it harder to get aid in safely and effectively. We're just relaying the positions reported here.
Understood. And the global reaction mentioned.
It reflects how serious this was. The UK apparently paused trade talks with Israel. EU lawmakers were pushing to review agreements. And big protests reported Washington, London, Istanbul.
Calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah, immediate ceasefire and a humanitarian corridor. It just highlights the immense human cost and the international pressure these situations create. It really puts a spotlight on international law, human rights, the difficulties of aid in conflict zones, huge global ripple effects.
Okay, let's shift focus again, but stay with political events. A dramatic report from Europe this time, a suspected assassination in Spain.
Yeah, this one sounds like something out of a spy novel. The individual was Andrei Portnov.
Yeah, who was he?
The source identifies him as a close ally of the former pro-Russian Ukrainian president Yanukovych.
Ah, okay.
He'd faced accusations of undermining Ukraine's democracy, fled back in 2014, was sanctioned by the U.S. and EU.
And the current Ukrainian government.
They had started treason proceedings against him, according to the brief, alleging ties to Russian intelligence. So you can see the context.
Definitely paints a picture. So what will happen?
He was shot dead, right outside a school in Madrid.
Just like that. And it's being treated as
a suspected political assassination. Spanish police are apparently looking into potential foreign involvement.
And he knew he was at risk.
Seems so. The brief mentions he was actually living under police protection in Spain because of alleged threats.
Wow. So the implications here.
Well, the source links it to this wider, often hidden conflict between Ukraine and Russia, points out other targeted killings in Europe related to this.
Raises serious questions about security for exiled figures, whistleblowers.
Exactly. And the brief notes Madrid police actually stepped up surveillance on other high-risk political farms in the city after this. Shows how far these conflicts can reach.
Yeah, a stark reminder that these geopolitical tensions don't always stay within neat borders. The risks are real, even far away.
Okay. Shall we move on to the business and economy sections?
Yeah, let's switch gears. And the big story on that front, according to the brief, was a pretty sharp drop in the U.S. stock market.
Right. The source connects this directly to renewed worries about an economic plan proposed by President Trump.
The one with big tax cuts? Infrastructure spending.
Yeah, massive tax cuts, more spending on defense and infrastructure. But the key issue, apparently, was a lack of clear detail on how it would all be paid for. No offsets mentioned.
And the market didn't like that uncertainty, the numbers.
The Dow Jones fell over 800 points, the source said.
Significant.
Yeah, and other indices saw similar drops, plus a sharp rise in bond yields.
Which signals?
Often signals dropping investor confidence, either in the government's finances or the economic outlook, or both.
And economists cited in the source. What were their main concerns?
Potential to balloon the national debt, number one.
Yeah.
Also potentially trigger inflation.
Which could force the Fed's hand on interest rates.
Exactly. Force them to raise rates more aggressively than planned. The source laid out the plan's components, those tax cuts, spending hikes, and quoted critics worried it would undo recent efforts to, tighten fiscal policy.
Was there a counter-argument mentioned?
Oh, yeah. Supporters argued the growth from deregulation and stimulus would outweigh the deficit risks in the long run. That was their take, according to the brief.
So the ripple effects for people listening.
Yeah.
What does this kind of market reaction mean?
Well, rising bond yields make borrowing more expensive. For the government, sure, but also for companies and for individuals, think mortgages, loans.
Could slow down growth then.
Potentially, yeah. And some analysts mentioned in the brief were even wondering if this was the start of a bigger market correction, not just a one-day thing. Really shows how sensitive markets are to fiscal policy signals.
So for you, this matters because government spending debates can hit your wallet, borrowing costs, investment, savings. It's all connected.
Absolutely.
Also on the economic front, the brief mentioned oil prices dropped noticeably.
Yeah, a few things seem to come together there based on the source.
Like what?
Well, first, U.S. oil inventories were higher than expected, partly blamed on warmer weather, reducing heating oil demand, and maybe refineries running better.
Okay, more supply.
Right. And then there was anticipation that OPEC plus Outblow, the big oil producers group, might decide to increase production quotas at their upcoming meeting.
Adding even more supply globally.
Exactly. So you've got fears of a supply glut building up, just as signals were suggesting global demand might be weakening a bit.
Where was demand weakening?
The source mentioned slowing industrial output, particularly in China and Europe.
Got it. So supply up, demand may be softening, price goes down. What was the number?
Brent crude dropped over 1.6%, fell below $64 a barrel.
And within OPEC plus drink. Any tensions noted?
The source did mention apparent divisions, the usual suspects like Saudi Arabia and Russia debating whether to focus on market share producing more or propping up prices by holding back.
It's always that balancing act. So lower oil prices, good for consumers at the pump, maybe?
Usually, yeah. Cheaper gas, but
bad for oil-producing countries and companies.
Right. Hurts their revenues, squeezes U.S. shale producers too. Investors were definitely watching that OPEC meeting closely. A long downturn could mean less investment, job cuts in the energy sector.
So it's news that hits you directly if you drive, but also has these much bigger global economic ripples.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift now. Science and technology. The brief highlighted a pretty major public health development.
Yeah, this one felt significant. England launching the world's first national rollout of a gonorrhea vaccine.
That is a big deal. Why now?
Well, as the source explains, gonorrhea has become increasingly resistant to antibiotics. Real superbug fears.
Right, I've heard about that.
The WHO even classified it as a priority pathogen, meaning we urgently need new ways to prevent and treat it. So this vaccine is like the first preventative breakthrough for STIs in decades.
Wow. And how does it work? What are the details?
It's being rolled out nationwide by NHS England, and interestingly, it's derived from an existing vaccine for meningitis B.
Oh, okay. How effective is it?
Well, the source says early trials showed modest efficacy, around 30–40%.
Not super high then.
No, but health officials quoted in the source argue that even that partial immunity could drastically cut overall transmission, which is key because cases, especially among young adults in the UK, had apparently risen sharply.
Makes sense. So who gets it first?
The rollout is targeting high-risk groups initially, people under 25, those with multiple partners.
And the hope is, if it works well there.
It could potentially be expanded globally, maybe even be a template for other STI vaccines down the line.
Any caveats mentioned?
Yeah, the source notes some experts caution it shouldn't replace safer sex education and regular testing. It's another tool, not a magic bullet.
Still, a major step in fighting antibiotic resistance and tackling STIs. Very significant.
Definitely a key development for public health.
Also in tech, the brief covered the latest from DeepMind in the AI space.
Ah, yes, VO3, an AI video generator.
So AI generating video, how good is it?
Well, the source explains that video has been tougher for AI than still images. Getting that frame-to-frame consistency, making it look coherent, that's the challenge.
Right, makes sense.
VO3 apparently makes a leap forward here. It uses better temporal modeling, understanding time, and refined aesthetic training, builds on their earlier work like Imogen and Gemini.
So what can it do, according to the source?
It's described as DeepMind's most advanced model so far. It can create high-res, context-aware video clips just from text prompts.
Just from text? Wow.
Yeah. It apparently uses multimodal training, so it understands narrative, style, scene coherence. The source calls it a major leap in AI creativity and storytelling.
The potential impact sounds huge.
Oh, yeah. The brief discusses how it could transform industries. Film, education, marketing, gaming, reducing costs, making content creation more accessible.
There have to be concerns, right?
Absolutely. The source flags them clearly. Misuse is the big one, deepfakes, using people's likeness without permission.
Yeah, that's scary stuff.
And the brief notes Google, DeepMind's parent company, says they're committed to mitigating this. Things like watermarking videos, developing ways to track content.
So, incredible potential for creativity, but bundled with some really serious ethical challenges from day one.
That sums it up perfectly. Pushing boundaries, but raising critical questions about authenticity, misuse, and the future of media itself.
Okay, let's switch gears again. Weather and disasters.
Yeah.
And this section, unfortunately, had some grim news, too.
Yes. Catastrophic flooding reported in New South Wales, Australia.
What caused it?
The source points to a couple of factors. Meteorologists linked the historic rainfall to ongoing La Niña conditions, which often bring more rain to eastern Australia.
Okay.
But also, they mentioned broader, long-term shifts in climate patterns as a contributor.
Is the air prepared?
Apparently not adequately, despite warnings. The source mentions issues like outdated flood infrastructure, limited emergency funding.
And this region had been through a lot already, right?
Exactly. The brief highlights that this came after years of intense bushfires and drought. So the land, the communities were already highly vulnerable, made the impact of sudden heavy rain much worse.
Just how bad was it? The scale.
Immense, according to the report. Historic rainfall, record floods, over 48,000 residents affected. At least 3 deaths reported, sadly.
Terrible.
Rivers overflowed, submerged homes, schools, critical roads in multiple towns, described in the source as the worst flood in parts of that region in over 100 years.
And the response.
Massive evacuation and rescue efforts. The brief mentions military helicopters airlifting people from rooftops, damages expected to run into the billions.
Billions? Wow. Any longer-term reaction?
Yeah, the source says the severity intensified calls within Australia for things like a national disaster insurance scheme and definitely for faster investment in climate resilience infrastructure, preparing for more extreme events.
It's another stark example, isn't it? The increasing impact of extreme weather and that whole debate around adaptation and infrastructure.
Absolutely. Puts climate resilience right back in the spotlight.
All right, let's round things out with the final section. Sports.
Okay. And the brief featured a big result from European football.
The Europa League final.
That's the one. Tottenham Hotspur versus Manchester United.
What was the backstory going in?
Well, the source notes, Spurs, Tottenham were under pressure. They'd just narrowly missed out on qualifying for the Champions League through their domestic league.
Ah, so this was their second chance to get in.
Exactly. And their manager, Ange Postecoglou, his tactics focusing on possession and counterattacks were highlighted. Manchester United, on the other hand, reportedly had injury problems, maybe lacked a bit of cohesion.
So the result?
Tottenham won 1-0. Clinched their first major European trophy in, over 40 years, the source said?
Wow, that's huge for them. Where was the final?
In Bilbao. And the brief mentions the details. Harry Kane scored the winner in the second half.
Of course he did.
And their goalkeeper, Guglielmo Vicario, got man of the match for some crucial saves. Kept that clean sheet.
So what are the implications of that win?
Big ones, according to the source. For Spurs, it means automatic entry into next season's Champions League group stage. Huge boost for status, finances.
And for Manchester United.
The loss likely means more scrutiny for the manager, potential shakeups in the offseason, not the ending they wanted.
And for the fans?
Hailed as a sign of Tottenham's resurgence, apparently, a return to Europe's top table.
It's amazing how much rides on one game. Excitement, implications for the clubs, the whole narrative.
Definitely. That's sports for you.
So looking back at this single day, May 21st, 2025, it's incredible the range. International tensions, humanitarian crises, market swings.
Scientific breakthroughs, AI leaps, climate disasters, major sports victories, all happening simultaneously.
It really was a packed day across the globe.
And maybe that's a final thought for you listening to consider. How do all these things, these seemingly separate events, how do they connect? You know, a trade dispute sparked by online narratives, a blockade causing global protests, AI raising ethical alarms, climate impacts demanding new infrastructure, even a football match shifting club fortunes.
Yeah.
How do they influence each other in ways we might not immediately see?
Yeah.
A snapshot like this just reminds you how interconnected everything really is.
That's a great point to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the day's news.